The Canadian government puts forward a new hate speech bill. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberal Party are playing with the idea of expanding hate speech legislation through a new bill. Now, we've been here before, we've had this conversation, and the same issues keep cropping up with no real answer to them, and we'll get to that. But a couple of things to get out of the way first. There are already certain limitations to speech in Canada. Some of them make a lot of sense. You can't go around threatening people. You can't go calling for violence. You can't be lying directly about people. When you're in court, you can't speak nonsense either or perjure yourself. These things make sense. And it's not to say that in all domains speech should be completely free. I do like the notion overall of free speech, but we should be careful with each restriction we put on it. These things come with massive consequences if used incorrectly. And we can see places around the world today where speech is throttled completely. And to go from point A to point B, it's not that far. It's not that complicated. You start with small encroachments, and the right government, with the wrong mindset, can easily alter the rules to make you subjugated. That's the fact of the matter. So, of course, people are weary when a government comes in and tries to tell you what you can and cannot say. Of course, when you look at it from a legal perspective too, speech is such a gray area. It's not like the government telling you something like you can't rob things that aren't yours. That's quite literal, and it makes a lot of sense to anyone who's using logic. But in the realm of hatred and speech and stuff that you may not like, there's a lot of ambiguity to it. We'll touch on that as well in a bit. Now, the National Post wrote an opinion article on the matter, and I want to go through it. They start by acknowledging that social media, in its current state, is a hellscape. It's littered with toxic nonsense from people who represent positions across the entire political spectrum. And even people who aren't political. There's just hatred and toxicity and bullying everywhere on social. And here is where we get to the first common misconception of people who oppose things like hate speech laws. It's not like people are saying hatred is not a thing, that social media is just rainbows and butterflies. That's not the point. Hatred is certainly a reality. Hateful speech is certainly a reality. The question is what do you do about it, though? And who gets to define it? And who gets to enforce that? And what criteria are we working with when we try to encapsulate such a vague term? Now, to some people who are thinking very simply about the matter, they see the problem, hateful speech, and they jump to conclusions such as it should be outlawed, without considering all the nuance there, and it's a major mistake. The article touches on that sentiment because they put out the point that from this perspective of seeing all the crazy stuff that we do on social, they can understand why perhaps the average person might seek a solution to that comes via the government or via laws and regulations. And here comes good old Trudeau. Bill C-36. This was introduced on the final hours of the last sitting day of Parliament, and it's an attempt to replace a section of the Canadian Human Rights Act that was already repealed several years ago due to fears that it was being abused by specific groups to silence views that they disagreed with. And that's kind of the crux of the issue with hate speech laws, the potential for them to be used by a specific group to silence views they disagree with. Once you outlaw hate speech, it's simply a matter of putting things in that bucket to make them no longer sayable. Now, this new bill introduced by the Liberal government, it attempts to tighten up the definition of hatred. It says that hatred means the emotion that involves detestation or vilification, and that is stronger than dislike or disdain. Okay, so first of all, I think that's pretty standard. People generally understand what hatred means. And it goes on to say, for greater clarity and certainty, the communication of a statement does not incite or promote hatred for the purposes of this section, solely because it discredits, humiliates, hurts, or offends. Now, that is a step in the right direction, making it clear that just because you are offended doesn't mean someone has spewed hatred at you. Just because you don't like what someone's saying, because it hurt your feelings, because you got triggered, whatever. In this bill, supposedly, that won't count. But The bill also amends the criminal code to enable an individual to go to court with the Attorney General's assent if they fear on reasonable ground, quote unquote, that another person may commit an offense motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on race, national, or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical ability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other similar factor. To qualify as a violation of the Human Rights Act, hate speech would have to be made in public via social media, personal website, mass email, or online comment section. Private messages and direct messages would not qualify, yet, wherever it appears, whether an assertion crosses this invisible line into a hate crime, that would still depend on the subjective interpretation of an unelected official or appointed judges who are already supposed to be guided by past court interpretation in any case. So that comes straight from the National Post, and there's a lot to break down there. So let's go back up to the top. This bill is supposedly trying to tighten up the definition of the word hatred, and I don't see any tightening at all. It simply tells you that hatred is one level beyond dislike. Okay, that's pretty obvious. I don't think people had an issue with that to begin with. Then the second thing it does is it says, well, also to clarify, just because you're offended or hurt, it doesn't mean it's hate speech. And okay, we're on a similar ground there. I agree with that. The first part, I think it makes sense. I don't really have an objection to the literal definition of hatred. Now, the third thing we talked about is where things get dicey. As we go through this, keep in mind too, keep this at the back of your mind as we're talking about it, that although they have tried to define what hate speech is, they have not done so. They have failed to do it. This is just vagueness. The entire guideline, what we talked about, it can be bent and warped to fit a person's agenda because it's so flexible. And that's the wrong formula, in my opinion. So the bill, it also amended the criminal code. And if an individual is fearing on reasonable ground, whatever that is, that another person may commit an offense now that is motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on these protected criteria, they can take you before a judge and you can be found guilty. So, here's the thing though. There are all these criteria, and it's not entirely possible to tell from a rational point of view where one will cross the border between skepticism and critique and debate into what now is loosely being defined as hate speech. Let's go through some examples now. So let's say you take somebody like Sam Harris, who is a very public intellectual. He's not Canadian, so this wouldn't apply to him, but for the sake of argument and thinking, let's presume he is Canadian. Now, he's very popular for his critique of religion, which happens to be one of these protected criteria under the criminal code due to the amendment. Now, if he were to say what he usually does, things that disparage religion, his critique about it, him saying that certain aspects here are nonsense, they do this and this and that, a very hard-hitting critique that offends many people, that hurts their feelings. And even though we've said that the bill tries to say, well, just because you're hurt, it doesn't mean it's hate speech per se, it could be an inkling or an indicator that complicates the matter. Because look at the thing called reasonable ground. If someone is offending someone, maybe that's a reasonable ground that they may commit a further offense, and maybe that's enough to get you before the criminal court. It's possible because of how loosely defined this is. So, to play it safe, maybe Sam is afraid now to critique religion in the way he does. Maybe he's afraid that he'll be committing a criminal offense now. And some nut who doesn't like what he's saying is going to label it as hate speech, and they'll get a big movement behind them on social media, and they'll drag him to court, and he'll be found guilty. And essentially, here you go. You've created a blasphemy law. Amazing stuff. Now, somebody might say to me, well, that's an exaggeration. That will never happen. And my retort back is, how can you be sure it will never happen? I do agree this is just speculation, but speculation is actually all that we have because of how loosely defined the bill is. To tell me that this would never happen is actually foolish, because it comes down to the question, who is going to define hatred? Are you going to define it where you think that what Sam Harris says is okay? Or is somebody who is more sensitive going to define it, who thinks that what he's saying is not okay? Is it going to be Justin Trudeau defining it, and he thinks it's not okay? Or will it be Aaron O'Toole defining it, who thinks it's okay? When you create a loose, vague, open to interpretation law, it's going to be interpreted by those who have power. Whether it's the mob, who has a lot of power today, the social media woke mob, or whether it's going to be government, it's not good. Because when you forfeit that power to those in control, you one day might not like who is in control. And when they start making rules that are distasteful to you, then you'll realize the foolishness of your ways. Why even arm them with this weaponry to begin with? And you have to go back to the fundamental issue here. It's that we're seeing a lot of hateful content on social media. People are mean, they're bullying each other. Sure. One potential solution is through the courts and the legal system and putting in penalties and fees and whatnot. There are multiple solutions to this problem, though, and they might be worth exploring versus jumping the gun to this, which I do see as an encroachment on our remaining free speech and expression in Canada. Perhaps it's simply a matter of social media needing a verification process. People are free to commit acts of hate and whatever, largely because they are able to remain anonymous. And sometimes they're just bots. You don't even know who you're talking to sometimes. Is it actually a real person or not? It's very different compared to something like when you're talking to someone face to face, because there are so many social interactions at play there. And your identity is revealed, so you do feel more responsible for the things that you're putting out. Maybe that's one route we can go down. Maybe there's something to say about social media playing a more active role in terms of moderating their platforms. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but that's another approach. Maybe there's something to say about having a national conversation about how to operate and be respectful online. Maybe that can be added into the digital charter that we're trying to build in Canada. We're not optionless, and we're resorting to something that I would say is somewhat extreme. And now I do want to give one more example of something that might be hate speech now and get you taken to criminal court. It's Jordan Peterson, because he comes to mind with his critique of things like transgenderism. Is that now going to be qualifying as something that could be a reasonable ground that will permit you to drag him before a judge under this amendment to the criminal code and get him tried for his critique of the ideology? Perhaps. You can't really tell me no. It definitely could be. And as time progresses, it could actually become the norm. These are dangerous games that we're playing here. Such an ill-defined bill that has the impact of silencing many conversations going on about many controversial things in our world. And of course, you do get the hate speech, hateful speech, whatever you want to call it, with that conversation. But when you toss out the baby with the bathwater, you might end up with nothing. You might lose the hate speech, but you might just lose the logical speech with it. These considerations have to be talked about and debated. You have to use your free speech to get through the hurdles of these type of notions. This law is essentially putting in an invisible line, one that is subjective to the interpreter, and real people could face real consequences for things that are rationally not hate speech, but have now been transformed and transmuted into something that fits into that box. Now, we can go back to the article, and there are some experts who chime in. They say despite the new wording in this bill, it may be abused in much the same way as previous iterations by using it as a tool to silence people by threatening to haul them before a judge over views that may be unpopular or controversial, but nothing more. And I would agree with that. Now, I didn't write down who actually said that. I forget now. But it's referenced in the National Post article. You can look it up. Now, that's 100% accurate. Someone who is speaking simply controversially, we're talking about an unpopular opinion, but by any logical standard is not engaging in hate, they can be silenced by this tool, by this new power. And it all goes back to the central issue. Who gets to define what hate speech is? That's the issue with all hate speech legislation. You might like the person defining it today, but there's no guarantee they'll be the person defining it tomorrow. If you're on the left, imagine you put that law into place. And then, who do you hate the most? Maybe Trump becomes the Prime Minister of Canada somehow. And he starts to use that hate speech law to say, well, if you are hating on Donald Trump, it's now illegal under hate speech laws. He's interpreting it that way. Will you be very happy about having him at the helm of this definition crisis? I don't think so. So really think about the powers you're bestowing to the government. This game is subjective by nature, and when you talk about adding things to the criminal code, you have to understand that there are differences between hate speech interpretation and other crimes. So to give you a crude example, take being stabbed. There isn't a subjective realm with that. You getting stabbed is a sharp object entering your body, creating a puncture, and it leaving. And there's evidence for that, and anyone who is logical and hasn't lost their mind can look at you and say, yeah, that person has been stabbed. Clearly. When it comes to hate speech, though, when someone looks at what you're experiencing, they can look at you and say, is this person a victim of hate speech? I'm not too sure, actually. There isn't a clear sign. There isn't a clear definition. We have no idea, really. Now, the person can tell you that they are, and another person can dispute it and say, well, you might not be, actually. And that's the problem with these subjective laws. The difference between something like getting shot or stabbed versus something like a restriction on speech. In these more vague areas, you have to be very careful about how you implement rules and regulations because they could backfire on you and the rest of us very easily. Now, I'll conclude by giving my opinion on the Liberal Party at this current point in time. So I actually had a lot of goodwill for them. You may have noticed my tone in previous episodes talking about Trudeau and the Liberal Party. I, for one, thought they handled the pandemic quite well. You know, at times it got kind of shaky, but there's no doubt. They secured the vaccines for us. They put into place the proper restrictions, albeit a little bit slow in some cases, but not as disastrous as other places around the world, and maybe even certain places within Canada. Certain provinces did not fare that well, but it really wasn't the fault of the federal government. I was slightly optimistic about Trudeau. You know, he seemed to be moving to a center-left position, which I thought was fair, but at the back of my mind, I always had those questions about the ethical scandals that he encountered, from SNC to the We Charity. You know, it was clear to me that he wasn't of the utmost outstanding character. He was good at putting on a show. The way he talks and the way he presents himself, I guarantee you he's nothing like that behind the scenes. Everything he says is scripted. I don't remember him giving a real answer to anything. Just the way he talks is not genuine, in my opinion, and that's fine. That's the political game. His actions speak louder than the facade he's put on, getting implicated in all these scandals. And then we looked at Bill C-10, the online censorship that he was trying to put in. And the fact that he was doing things like shutting down debate, trying to move it along. But still, there wasn't that much red flags going off because the media does sometimes take a more tender approach towards him. So, I didn't like Bill C-10. I thought he was a fool for trying to pass it through, especially with no debate. Now, hopefully the Senate has some wisdom, and they reject it, and they laugh at him. But now we have another bill coming from the Trudeau Liberals, trying to implement a more refined approach to hate speech regulation, and it's just complete foolishness. If he was really trying to curb the issue of hateful content on social media, we should have a national discussion on it. We should talk about the various approaches to that. Not be trying to submit bills last minute hoping they get through under the radar, so the Senate will pass them, and we'll be looking at a new Canada. There's no doubt there is actually a problem here. Toxicity is a real thing. But we had no conversation about the best approach. And further, he talks about this bill clarifying things, and it does not do that. It's still as obscure as all its predecessors. I do not like the trajectory of this government and the things that they seem to be interested in implementing as of late. It's becoming problematic, and he has certainly lost the goodwill he gained from me from his pandemic response, and it's unfortunate. and I think he definitely knows this, that the competition is weak. If there actually was a formidable competitor to Trudeau, he would have been tossed a long time ago. Trudeau is nothing special. But due to the fact that we're looking at someone like Jagmeet Singh and Erin O'Toole and the Bloc Québécois and the People's Party, it's like, who are you actually going to decide between? It really is Trudeau or O'Toole, but O'Toole's been doing a terrible job at marketing himself. If you look at these support polls, the Conservative Party support has continued to fall off a cliff. So even though Trudeau is engaging in madness here, you really are faced with the problem of not having a proper alternative. And he knows that. So he's trying to push the bill as far as he can, trying to see how much leeway he can take advantage of until things start to shake. When he notices his polling starts going down, I guarantee you he'll stop engaging in these lackluster maneuvers. But because he's in a prime position to capitalize, he's doing that. So, something to keep your eye on, for sure. Like always, I'll update you on the latest news on this issue. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share to help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.